Good day, everyone. It is Caitlin, and today we are taking that basic bodice that we draped last month and changing it up to give ourselves some variety in our 1830s wardrobes. So last month what we did is we made a bodice pattern for the 1830s. So I have done what we discussed. Last time y'all saw was just still a fitting, but we talked about how we were going to add seam allowance to everything, and I labeled my pieces. And so I've done that, exactly what we discussed. So Edith is the mannequin, and it's front opening 1830s bodice back. And I just said that there's a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so that way I remember. And I reminded myself to cut the center back on the fold, because this is a front opening bodice. And this is just a back piece. So I want to show y'all today is ways to modify this very basic pattern to make it, to give yourself different styles. And so what we're going to talk about first is the back. So I'm going to give you several ways to change up the back, to do different things with the back, and then we'll move on to the front and do the same thing. So back piece, I'm going to set that aside. I have some extra back, so I've cut. We can discuss sort of what we want to do. Actually, I'm going to pick one that's a little less wrinkled. Alright, so the very first thing is that in a lot of 19th century dresses, what you see is this little curved detail in the back that kind of gives it a slimming shape. So there's two ways you can get a curved detail to your back, and I'm going to give you both. So on a lot of originals, what you see is just, it's literally a tuck. It's not a separate piece. And other times you see it where there's an actual 3-piece back. So I'm going to mark what I would do. So you're generally, for the 30s, you want to start about where your shoulder seam is. So remember, this is neckline, shoulder seam, armhole, side seam. So I'm going to start basically where this point is. And you want to end pretty close. There's usually about an inch or an inch that, so we're going to mark, there's no seam allowance here. So mark about, that's about 3/4 of an inch. And we're going to play like connect the dots, basically. If you don't like that shape, I kind of don't. We're going to make it a little bit more curved evenly. Okay? And that's literally it. From here to here, and you just kind of just connect with the sloping line. There's so many different shapes to these backs, so you'll see some of them go a little bit further down and make it a little bit more of an extreme curve. You don't see them past the shoulder seam, so don't put them on the shoulder. This point to maybe an inch down here, somewhere in this range, and you want it about. So there's two ways you can make this up. The first is just to mark this on your pattern, turn it inside out, and literally take a tuck. So I take this with my lining attached, so it would be the dress fabric and the lining, and I would do a little back stitch right across. Maybe taking up, see, I'll model it with a pen. Not very much, it's literally the scantest little amount of fabric. We're going to pretend it's the back stitch and not a running stitch. Okay, just like that. And on the back, what you have is what looks like a seam, even though it's not a seam, it's just a tuck. This is honestly the easiest method because you're not sewing any curved lines. This can be very difficult to sew. Also, if you have a plaid or a stripe, this will almost perfectly match it because you're taking up the tiniest little bit of fabric. You're never going to be able to match a plaid on a curved seam like this. That's a given. You look at originals, none of them are matched either. The ones that get super, super close, that where it looks like the seamstress is very, very talented. Oh my gosh, she got that curved seam that was matched perfectly. It's not a curved seam, it's a tuck. And she literally took a 1/16 of an inch, so her plaid is a 1/16 of an inch off because she just took a tuck. Easiest way to do it. But if you wanted to do a 3-piece back, that is also perfectly valid. What you would do is cut along this line and go make new pattern pieces. Add a 1/2 inch seam allowance or whatever your seam allowance is, whether it's you do 1/2 inch or 3/8 of an inch or 5/8 of an inch or whatever you do, whatever the rest of the pattern is. And you would add 1/2 inch seam allowance on your back side and then 1/2 inch seam allowance on your side back side, and that way you could stitch them together and make it a true 3-piece back. I find the tuck to be easier you see that a lot more in extant garments than you see the actual true three-piece back. But some people prefer the true three-piece back, and that's fine too. If you want to have your separate pieces and not have to worry about taking a tuck, go for it. But that is two ways to get the curved back detail that you see in originals. I'm going to put this to the side. Let's talk about if we wanted to add some gathering to the back. So let's say we wanted not a full gathered bodice, but something that was gathered at the very bottom. So here's what I would do for that. I'm going to decide how much, usually about halfway. If I'm going to do that, and I would cut my, this is just a blank. This is not my fashion fabric. This is extra fabric I have. This is a pattern piece. And I'm going to make some lines about halfway up. Now I'm going to get more scrap fabric. Put this down. And I'm going to kind of move out these little arms, basically, to give myself a little bit of excess. I'm going to cut a new pattern piece. Okay. So this is now my pattern piece. So I have a new pattern piece now. Now let's say this is my back lining. And this is my back. I'm going to line it up here at the center. And I could run a gathering thread right here until these sides match. And then have a little bit of a gathered back. It would still be fitted at the neckline. It's just going to be gathered at the bottom. I could also do tucks. And it just gives a little fun detail to the back. Now I could also, with that same piece, we don't want to waste anything. Where'd it go? Now let's say this time I wanted to do a bodice with either tucks or gathers at the top and the waistline. In that case, you just cut the strips all the way up. And I did about inch wide strips. You could do half-inch ones if you want like a lot of gathers. You're going to cut those all the way up. You're not going to cut, I wouldn't cut any on the shoulder seam, I would just cut the neckline like that. I cut these pretty close, but not actually taking them apart. And again, same thing, I'd put this on some fabric, some scrap fabric, space them out. Just like that. Cut a whole new piece. And then I have one that I can gather on the top and the bottom, or pleat on the top and the bottom. Both of those perfectly. So those are some ways to modify the back pieces of your bodice. Either by making a fully pleated or tucked look, just one with the bottom pleats or tucks, and the three-piece back look, either the faux three-piece back with a tuck, or the true three-piece back where you actually cut out the pieces and have a side back and a back. Let's move on to how we're going to modify the front in some ways. So this is the pattern that we made. Again, my little marking in the front to make sure I put this on the bias because I will never remember on my own. It is such a foreign concept to me. 10 years of doing mid-century stuff where we do not put the fronts on the bias, we cut everything on the straight grain, except for some side sleeves. But all bodices are in the front grain, and then the 30s just messes with my brain that way. So I have my little mark here to remind myself to cut it on the bias. That is the front opening, 1830s Bodice. This is her front piece, and we're going to modify it a couple different ways. I have the dart here. So what we drafted for was a darted bodice. So let's say I don't want a darted bodice. I want a tucked bodice or a gathered bodice. Well, that's simple. Cut the same pattern. Dart your lining, because that'll help it fit better, but you don't have to do that. You can dart, you can gather and pleat the lining and the fashion fabric together, but you could also dart the lining and then pleat over to make it fit. So let's say I had my dart here, and I would just pleat or run a gathering thread to make my fashion fabric match my lining. I could also take my fashion fabric and my lining, put them together, run a gathering thread and gather them both together, run a gathering thread and gather them both up together, or pleat them both up together. Either way, it's perfectly fine. Easy. That's the easiest way to do it. If you're going to, now I did cut out this dart. I don't usually cut out my darts. I did this for the pattern so I can mark where my dart goes. I can mark with a pen or one of those little erasable friction pens. That way, the markings of the darts on my pattern piece, I don't have to guesstimate where those are. So that's just on my pattern piece. I wouldn't actually cut this out if I was cutting out my lining or my fashion fabric. So that's basic, gathering it or pleating it as opposed to just darting it. Now let's say I wanted quite a few more gathers just in the bottom waist. Like I want it to be fitted up in the neckline, but I want it to be very full on the bottom. So what I would do is basically the exact same thing we did with the other bodice, the back bodice. Cut strips. They don't have to be even. It's about an inch, inch and a half from your neckline. Now, in this type of bodice, I really would suggest darting your lining as is usual, and then putting this on top. Okay, and usually you don't see the very sides gathered up like that. So when I go to cut out a new piece to test it out, it's like this. This does need to be on the bias. I'm going to kind of just fold them out like this. See how much more room that is giving me. That's giving me several inches pattern piece. I just fold it out like that. And I would cut brand new pattern piece and I would label it full front 1830s bodice pattern. Now if I wanted the neckline to be very gathered as well, I would do the same thing that we did with the back. I would cut it all the way up. And I could fold, put them. If I want just the neckline gathered, I would stop here. If I want the shoulder seam gathered too, I would continue cutting. Probably cut one more out. I'd cut a whole new pattern out and label this one, whatever you want to label it as. And so that's one way to do that. Now, with this type of bodice and with just the bottom full bodice with the fitted top, I would put this over your normal bodice line. So I'd cut a normal bodice lining pattern. So cut this out of your lining, or cut your lining out of this. And then I cut the fashion fabric of the new pattern piece and then gather or pleat to fit this. That's going to give you a better fit. So let's go ahead and I'm going to make up a pattern real quick, just a basic bodice pattern for an opening dress. I'm going to show you how to change the neckline and also how to make a yoked bodice very quickly. Here we are with Edith again, and I have a bodice pattern. Bodice piece, and we're doing the same thing. We'll just put it inside out. You don't have to do this, I just like doing it, and it's habit at this point. So I have her dress. Darts are not taken up. I'm not worried about that right now. What we're going to do first is change the neckline. Because you do see in the 30s, even in day dresses, low necklines. You fill them in with a kerchief, you can fill them in with a chemisette, you can cover them with a pelerine. Lots of different options, but it just makes the dress more versatile. You do see a lot in lower neck dresses. You do see high neck dresses, so it's perfectly acceptable. But a lot of times you may want to take that and turn it into a low neck dress. It is cooler a lot of the times just to fill in with a sheer, like a net chemisette or a nice cool kerchief. And it's cooler than having all the fabric with the lining and all that in there. So what we're going to do is literally just play connect the dots. So you decide where you want the dress on your shoulder. So a lot of times they may come up to the shoulder. You don't want anything below the shoulder, otherwise it's just going to up to the shoulder. You don't want anything below the shoulder, otherwise it's just going to fall off right off your shoulder. So pick your shoulder, maybe about half an inch in for a really low necked And you don't want your chemise to show, so definitely pick somewhere above your chemise. This is where her chemise sits. I'm going to put about 1/2 inch above that. You don't really want cleavage to show. And just connect the dots. That could be that. You could do a V neckline. So you could start it, let's say here. And make it a lot more prominent. And make a V neck instead of a sloped neck. I could make this a little bit more sloped if I wanted. There we go. We're just playing on scrap fabric. So I could do a V neck, I could do a swoop neck, I could do a half high neck. So if I wanted it just to be a little bit lower than this, I can do that. You see that on originals. Like that. Or you can bring it down a little bit lower. Like that. Back, it's kind of the same thing. You can do just a little half one. Or I could really make it low. Again, figure out where your chemise ends. Draw it till you like it. And you're going to cut on that. So this does not have a seam allowance on it. So what I would do, before I cut this out, I would add a little 1/2 inch seam allowance. Let's go ahead and go with this lower neck option. All the way around. That way when I cut out my lining in my bodice piece, when I turn that edge under, because I'm going to do a piped edge, I still have, it's not too low. Because if I did it on this line, 1/2 inch from here is my chemise. You'd see my chemise poking out. But since I added that seam allowance, it should be good. Let's go ahead and talk about doing a yoked bodice. So a yoked bodice is basically where you have this sometimes high neck, sometimes half neck, sometimes low neck gown, and right above the bust, it's fairly plain, and then it's super, super gathered down here. So let's see what you generally do for that. It's pretty basically when you take the side seam and go straight across. You want it about your bust line or a little bit above your bust. Just like that. See kind of the straight line. I could also almost V it in slightly if I wanted to. I'm going to keep this one straight. And I could leave the back plain, not gathered at all, or I can also do a yoke in the back. I'm going to show you that as well, just so you have it. Again, right from here, basically just straight across. That worked. Alright. I'm going to take this off mannequin and I'll show you what to do for the next part to actually make this a yoke. Alright, here's our pattern. I'm going to go ahead and take out the seam. Alright, so let's see, here's my pattern. And I decided this was my line. I did add a seam allowance already, so we're good. I'm going to cut on my little seam allowance line. And then I'm going to cut straight across here. Alright, this is my yoke pattern. This is my front yoke. I would mark that. Don't forget, this is on the bias. I will always forget. Now this is the bottom yoke. And we're going to make this very full and gathered. So basically what we did before. Cut it all into strips. One thing I didn't think about though, this does not have seam allowance down here. So I'm going to add seam allowance. And I just always put SA for seam allowance. Alright. And you know the drill at this point is just take it and space it out. Try to space them out fairly evenly. And when you cut the new piece, you're going to add half your seam allowance up here, add your seam allowance down. Actually, this one has seam allowance. Add your seam allowance up here. That's really the only place we cut. And then you'll have a bottom yoke. So we label this piece as front bottom yoke. And you're going to do the same thing with your back. This is where we said we're going to cut it. And here. even all the way around. It's always a good thing. So this is my back yoke. And for this bottom, we're going to do the exact same thing. When you're pulling these pieces apart on this and the front, for a yoked bodice, you're going to want about 1.5 to 2 times the fullness. So my back right here is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10 inches wide on the bottom. So when I space this out, I want it to be somewhere between 15 and 20 inches to give me that space, the amount of fullness I want. Now with a yoke bodice, you probably do want to cut your normal bodice for your lining and then put the yoke over top of it. So let's see, I said I needed about 20 inches, which this is about 20, so I just need to space these out within that. There we go. So I would cut this out, add seam allowance on the top, and now I have a bottom back yoke for this case. And that's how you would modify this for a yoked bodice. So we talked about several ways to modify bodices. We talked about how to add the tucked back detail if you wanted that. We talked about how to add moderate fullness to just the bottom. We talked about how to add full fullness on the top and the bottom of both the fronts and the backs. We talked about changing the neckline, making it a half high or a low neck. We also talked about making a yoked bodice. So those are different ways you can modify your 1830s dress. So even if you didn't draft your own pattern like we did last month or drape your own pattern, if you have a normal regular 1830s bodice pattern and you made up the dress, you're looking to make a second dress and you want something different, you can take that pattern and you can do one of these things to it to give yourself some variety in your wardrobe. This doesn't have to be, you don't have to start with and do one of these things to it to actually make yourself a slightly different dress. And that way you don't have to buy a ton of patterns. You can just take your one base pattern that fits you really well and modify it. So hopefully that was helpful. Whether or not you draped your own bodice or not, if you're just using a commercial pattern, all of this will work for that. If you enjoyed this lesson and learned something, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. As always, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here on Monday.